for First Lieutenant Klaus Richter of the 352nd Artillery Regiment. The day started like every other morning along the Normandy coastline. A fine, moist fog draped itself across the English Channel, shrouding everything in a gray quietness. The atmosphere was frigid, saturated with the recognizable smell of brine and damp soil. The time had just passed 5 a.m., yet another shift, yet another day of nervous anticipation. However, as he peered through his field glasses, with the earliest trace of daybreak attempting to pierce the skyline, the ocean started to transform. This wasn't the current. This wasn't a meteorological system. This was something unthinkable. A shadowy boundary had emerged where ocean touched horizon, a blur that continued expanding, intensifying, and reproducing. This wasn't an armada. It was a metropolis of metal, a buoyant urban expanse emerging from the haze and entering the annals of time. In that instant, prior to any Allied servicemen stepping onto the sands beneath, prior to the globe learning the designations Omaha or Utah, he realized the Reich was facing its demise. To grasp the astonishment of that daybreak, one must comprehend the mentality of Fortress Europe during the spring of 1944. Extending from Norway's shoreline southward to the Spanish frontier, German construction crews had erected the Atlantic Wall. It was envisioned as a network of reinforced concrete and iron armed with artillery, an unbreachable defense against any assault. Within the thoughts of German supreme leadership and within the propaganda distributed to the troops, it represented evidence of the Reich's dominance. However, First Lieutenant Richter, a career military man and an Eastern Front survivor, recognized the distinction between propaganda and truth. At 32, he possessed enough years to recall an alternate Germany and sufficient youth to have been forged by the inferno of combat. He was realistic, perceptive, and profoundly exhausted. His assignment was an artillery unit featuring solid checkmate guns positioned within concrete emplacements several miles back from the shores the Allies would shortly designate Omaha. From his lookout station, a reinforced concrete shelter embedded into an elevated cliff, he possessed a superior perspective of the ocean. Every single day, he and his soldiers practiced. They computed targeting calculations, serviced their weapons, and gazed toward the slate-colored vacant waters. The conversation centered perpetually on the assault. Dare tag X, the decisive day. However, when would it arrive? And even more critically, at what location? German reconnaissance was convinced the primary offensive would materialize at the Pas de Calais, the narrowest span across the waterway. It was the logical selection. That's where the 15th Army, the majority of Germany's forces in the western region, stood prepared. Normandy was regarded as secondary, perhaps a location for a feint, but not the primary objective. This represented an enormous strategic error, and it was no coincidence. It was the consequence of a masterful Allied misdirection operation designated Operation Fortitude, and it rendered the Normandy protectors perilously vulnerable. Richter's formation, the 352nd Infantry Division, was superior to many in the region. However, it remained merely a remnant of the premier units that had subjugated France 4 years prior. It consisted of a blend of hardened fighters from the Eastern Theater, like himself, and a greater proportion of extremely youthful adolescent draftees and aging reserve personnel. They possessed bravery and discipline, yet they weren't the shock troops of 1940. They were protectors, assigned to maintain a perimeter that was overextended dangerously. The Atlantic Wall itself resembled more of a fragmented assembly than a continuous barrier. Numerous fortifications remained unfinished. Mine zones contained openings. The immense separations signified that even a formidable defensive location could be cut off and circumvented. Richter understood this. He had witnessed the paths nearby cultivators continue to utilize, the vulnerable areas in the firing zones. He maintained a career soldier's doubt regarding their prospects against a genuinely resolute offensive. Throughout the weeks preceding June, the strain had been palpable. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, charged with strengthening the fortifications, had been a tornado of motion. He He commanded the placement of millions of explosive devices and thousands of sharp metal barriers along the shorelines. The soldiers dubbed them Rommel's asparagus. Rommel grasped a reality that the supreme leadership in Berlin appeared to disregard. Should the Allies not be repelled at the coastline within the initial 24 hours, the conflict in the Western territories would be finished. Allied aviation would devastate any German backup forces attempting to advance toward the shore. The opening day was the sole day of consequence, yet on June 5th, the climate shifted. A tempest arrived with powerful gusts and turbulent waters. The German Weather Bureau assuredly forecasted an assault would be unfeasible for multiple days. This prediction permitted numerous high-ranking officers to unwind. It explained why Rommel himself wasn't present in France. He had traveled back to Germany for his spouse's birthday celebration. The tempest would maintain their security. Therefore, as Richter maintained his vigil in the pre-dawn cold of June 6th, the atmosphere was ordinary. The tempest had subsided, yet the waters remained turbulent. Nobody anticipated anything. He was gazing eastward when he initially noticed it. A glimmer. He lifted his formidable Zeiss-field glasses and concentrated. His pulse, which had been maintaining the unhurried cadence of a nocturnal shift, started to pound against his chest. It wasn't a glimmer. It was vessels, not a reconnaissance group, not a strike force. Countless numbers of them, and beyond them increasingly more. He panned his field glasses laterally. In every direction he observed, the situation was identical. The ocean was no longer slate-colored liquid. It had become a compact collection of shadowy, threatening forms. He experienced an icy terror ascend his vertebrae. It was the sensation of an individual confronting a mathematical dilemma he couldn't conceivably resolve. For an extended instant, Richter simply couldn't comprehend it. The absolute magnitude was an affront to reason. German reconnaissance had calculated the Allies might assemble 3,000 craft for an assault, and even that would have constituted a colossal undertaking. What he was observing was something entirely different. He attempted to enumerate, but it was a pointless pursuit. His mind instinctively started to classify. He could distinguish the massive outlines of capital ships and heavy cruisers. He observed clusters of more compact, swifter destroyers encircling them like predators. And then existed the additional vessels. The limitless, innumerable additional ones, invasion craft of every configuration and dimension, concentrated so compactly, they resembled metal fragments attracted to a lodestone. He blinked, massaged his vision, and observed once more. The scene didn't alter. It only became more distinct as the sun commenced its gradual ascent. The confirmed total for the complete mission would subsequently be validated at approximately 7,000 craft, a naval force from 8 separate countries. It continues to be the most extensive seaborne invasion armada in recorded history. However, to Richter, it wasn't a numerical figure. It was a tangible entity that appeared to distort the skyline. It was a proclamation of manufacturing capability so tremendous that it rendered everything he previously understood about military conflict antiquated. Germany had constructed a barrier of reinforced concrete. The Allies had countered by constructing a pathway of iron. He seized the military telephone, his palm damp with perspiration. "This is Richter at Lookout Station 4. I possess a sighting on the waterway. Vessels are present." The voice at the opposite end sounded weary and different. "We possess intelligence of several vessels, First Lieutenant. A potential strike. Maintain position." "Negative." Richter's tone was tense, pressing. "You fail to comprehend. It's not several vessels. It is thousands. The complete ocean is blanketed, from one skyline to the other. This is the moment. This is the assault." There existed a hesitation. Incredulity. Richter could nearly detect the individual imagining him as a panicked subordinate officer, frightened by illusions. "First Lieutenant, the ocean circumstances are not favorable. Our intelligence indicates." "Your intelligence is incorrect," Richter yelled, his tone fracturing. "I am observing it with my personal vision. For heaven's sake, observe the ocean." he hurled the receiver down in exasperation. It was too immense to be accepted. He attempted an alternate connection to unit command and located his superior officer. Richter communicating. Commander, the assault armada is present. 10,000 craft. He recognized he was overstating, yet in that instant, it seemed like a minimization. The major's tone was doubtful. Richter, are you positive? The climate is transparent enough to witness the conclusion of existence, Major, and it is positioned in the English Channel, seeking authorization to commence bombardment. This occasion, the pressing nature penetrated. The leadership hierarchy was immobilized by an absence of conception. Their strategies, their charts, their reconnaissance documentation. All of it was being nullified by the actuality floating several miles distant. While Richter was observing the armada, the supreme leadership was concentrated on intelligence of airborne troops further inland, presuming they constituted the primary occurrence. Nobody was observing the ocean. Richter didn't delay for them. He bellowed commands to his soldiers. Awakened by the disturbance, they peered outward from their stations. Their expressions a combination of wonder and dread. They witnessed what he witnessed. The exercises were concluded. This was actual. The massive projectiles were transported upward from the storage chambers. Distance calculators announced figures that appeared impossibly enormous. The colossal tubes of the artillery pieces, quiet for such duration, lifted gradually, directing their openings toward the unthinkable armada. Richter positioned himself in his station. Field glasses compressed to his vision. He could observe the invasion craft commencing to assemble. He could detect the tremor in the atmosphere, a subdued resonance of thousands of motors. It was the sound of a superpower respiring, and he was preparing to launch the initial projectile. The directive ultimately arrived shortly before 6 a.m. Commence at discretion. For Richter, it was a liberation. The immobility of disbelief was shattered by the recognizable precision of engagement. Discharge, he bellowed into the receiver. An instant afterward, the terrain shook as the initial gun discharged, then a subsequent one and a tertiary one. The projectiles shrieked outward across the liquid. Richter observed them through his field glasses, a wave of career satisfaction combining with his apprehension. He witnessed columns of liquid erupt within the center of the armada. A failure to connect, then an additional one. His soldiers were capable. They modified their targeting, discharging with a regimented tempo, and for a momentary period, they achieved their objective. Richter witnessed a precise impact on an American destroyer, the USS Corey. There existed a burst of amber and a cloud of ebony vapor. While certain records propose the craft may have additionally contacted a mine, from Richter's viewpoint, his artillery had secured initial casualties as the craft tilted, incapacitated, and subsequently descended. A celebration arose from his soldiers. For several minutes it seemed like an authentic engagement. It seemed like their preparation was significant. However, the sensation was temporary because following the Corey being struck, the armada did not disperse. It didn't decelerate. The void in the arrangement was merely occupied. The perpetual columns of craft continued advancing, a metallic current that couldn't be halted. His artillery discharged repeatedly and continuously, yet for every single craft they might trouble, 100 navigated past unaffected. Richter experienced a deep sensation of uselessness overwhelm him. He was an individual with a container attempting to drain the sea. He observed beyond his personal projectile detonations and perceived the broader scenario. The Allied capital ships, craft like the USS Texas, were currently rotating their enormous 14-inch artillery toward the coastline. Then arrived a response. It commenced as a subdued thunder from across the liquid. He witnessed bursts of illumination from the massive craft, resembling a soundless electrical disturbance on the skyline. Several seconds afterward, the atmosphere surrounding him commenced to rupture itself. The terrain commenced to convulse. Fountains of soil erupted from the terrain. The methodical manufacturing procedure of demolishing the Atlantic Wall had commenced. Where existed the German counteraction? Where existed the armored vehicles? Where existed the Luftwaffe? Richter examined the heavens and witnessed nothing except Allied aviation, interceptors, explosive carriers, transport craft. They dominated the airspace entirely. German military doctrine demanded armored counteroffensives, yet the nearest armored formation, the 21st Panzer Division, was immobilized by disarray and the requirement for an explicit directive from Hitler's command center. When it ultimately did advance, it advanced without aerial protection into heavens darkened with Allied attack aircraft, and it was annihilated prior to even arriving at the battlefront. It was, in that instant, with his personal artillery discharging and the heavens precipitating iron, that Richter comprehended. This wasn't an engagement. It was an eradication. The Allies weren't attempting to outflank him. They were attempting to eliminate him. This solitary individual comprehension of crushing strength characterized the complete Normandy operation. The account of how manufacturing dominance overshadowed military strategies is intricate and captivating. If you discover these thorough examinations into the less recognized viewpoints of historical events engaging, contemplate subscribing to the channel and activating the approval indicator. It permits us to persist in presenting these essential human narratives to visibility. As the maritime bombardment escalated, something in Richter's consciousness transformed. The strategic component of his mind deactivated. It was substituted by a frigid, horrifying lucidity. He was no longer observing craft and combatants. He was observing the mechanism underlying them. He was observing the manufacturing facilities. Through his quivering field glasses, he observed beyond the warcraft and witnessed in his imagination the production sequences of Detroit. He envisioned manufacturing facilities generating transport vehicles and motors on a magnitude Germany could merely fantasize about. The supply chain of this assault, the capacity to provision hundreds of thousands of personnel on a hostile coastline, wasn't a phenomenon. It was a straightforward consequence of that manufacturing capacity. He observed the heavens, saturated with a perpetual flow of C-47 transport aircraft and attack bombers. On D-Day, the Luftwaffe conducted perhaps 300 missions across all of France. The Allies conducted exceeding 14,000. For every single German aircraft in the atmosphere, there existed more than 40 Allied aircraft. The explanation wasn't an absence of German valor. It was the manufacturing facilities, and then existed the armored vehicles. He recognized the standing of the German panzers. The Tiger and the Panther were technologically advanced, dreaded by Allied operators, yet that advancement was a strategic termination. They were intricate, costly, and challenging to manufacture. For every intimidating Tiger armored vehicle that departed the production sequence, the Allies were producing dozens of more basic, yet devastatingly successful Sherman armored vehicles. Throughout the complete year of 1944, the U.S. exclusively would manufacture exceeding 29,000 armored vehicles. Germany's maximum monthly manufacturing, in comparison, never surpassed 2,000. The Allies weren't strategizing to prevail in armored engagements to excellence. They were strategizing to prevail by submerging the panzers beneath a mass of iron. This was the current actuality. This was the manufacturing calculation of failure. All the discussion of determination and ideological fortitude evaporated, confronting these figures. Nazi philosophy had guaranteed that a consolidated, resolute population could prevail over deteriorating democratic systems. However, here existed the evidence that philosophy couldn't halt an explosive carrier. Determination couldn't submerge a capital ship. Richter experienced a deep, nearly metaphysical hopelessness. He and his soldiers were capable combatants. They were preparing to perish, not because they were defeated in combat, but because they were overwhelmed on a magnitude that challenged understanding. They were contributors in a competition that was previously concluded. He and his soldiers, the complete German military in the Western region, resembled a meticulously manufactured blade confronting a mechanically powered crushing apparatus. The result of the competition was never uncertain. He contemplated the propaganda displays and the unwavering conviction back in their homeland an ultimate triumph. It was entirely a fabrication, not merely a governmental fabrication, but a numerical one. The German supreme leadership must have possessed knowledge. They must have examined the manufacturing statistics. Nevertheless, they had dispatched him and millions of additional individuals to participate in a conflict they couldn't conceivably prevail in. It's understandable that during the conflict's concluding year, the mental burden and the confrontation with this unthinkable reality resulted in an increase in self-terminations among commanders at the battlefront. They weren't merely combating soldiers from America, Britain, and Canada. They were combating the complete unrestricted capability of the planetary manufacturing apparatus. As the sun ascended higher, the theoretical transformed into a savage actuality. The maritime bombardment achieved a peak, a perpetual cascading thunder that never terminated. The reinforced concrete of the fortification trembled, particles descending from the overhead structure. Through the viewing aperture, Richter witnessed the initial surges of invasion craft contact the coastline. Higgins's craft released their access rams, expelling American combatants into the breaking waves. The automatic weapons in the German defensive positions along Omaha Beach commenced to discharge, penetrating into the formations of the initial personnel coming ashore. From his elevated position, Richter could witness the horrific spectacle develop. The liquid transforming crimson, the casualties accumulating. The German 352nd Infantry Division was imposing a terrible cost. For an instant, it appeared the protection was maintaining. The Americans were immobilized, yet then the manufacturing calculation reasserted itself once more. Allied destroyers, witnessing the carnage, executed something self-destructive and courageous. They navigated immediately toward the coastline, certain ones approaching to within 1,000 measurement units, grinding their lower structures on underwater barriers. They directed their artillery on the German fortifications, delivering immediate bombardment assistance in an action that reversed the situation on Omaha. Simultaneously, unusual novel equipment commenced to materialize. Richter observed as water-capable transport vehicles. The KWs apparently operated immediately out of the sea and onto the shoreline. He witnessed armored vehicles advancing ashore, certain ones outfitted with massive rotating devices to trigger explosive devices. These were Hobart's funnies, specialized armored machinery the British had created to surmount precisely these categories of protections. The Germans possessed nothing comparable to them. The spectacle on the shoreline beneath transformed from a confrontation into a systematic procedure of annihilation. German defensive locations were methodically neutralized and demolished by maritime projectiles, armored vehicle ammunition, and explosive devices. On Omaha Beach exclusively, calculations proposed the 352nd Division would experience approximately 1,200 losses that day, an astounding proportion of its combat personnel eliminated in a span of hours. Richter's personal unit was currently a principal objective. Projectiles descended increasingly proximate. A precise impact on one of the artillery positions dispatched a combustion sphere into the atmosphere. An additional gun was neutralized. His communication connections went inactive. He was cut off, his leadership demolished. He observed upward at the heavens one final occasion. It was a shifting overhead surface of Allied aviation. On the ocean, the initial surge of invasion craft was being substituted by a subsequent one and a tertiary one. Beyond them, the enormous armada remained expectantly, a transport mechanism of personnel and equipment that could, it appeared, function perpetually. The Allies would deploy approximately 1,500 armored vehicles on D-Day exclusively. The engagement for the shoreline was still continuing, yet the result had previously been established. It was merely a question of duration and mass. The conflict in Normandy would persist for an additional 2 months. The combat in the agricultural barriers would be savage and expensive, yet it would modify nothing. Every German armored vehicle demolished was a deficit that couldn't be compensated. Every Allied armored vehicle forfeited was substituted by 3 additional ones. Every German combatant who descended created a void in the perimeter that couldn't be occupied. For First Lieutenant Klaus Richter, and for the thousands of German combatants who endured that opening day, the remainder of the conflict was merely a conclusion. They combated onward, motivated by obligation, by apprehension, or by a nationalism separated from actuality. However, the expectation of triumph was extinct. It had disappeared in the daybreak illumination of June 6th. We frequently envision the conclusion of the Third Reich as a gradual, excruciating deterioration, reaching its peak in the engagement for Berlin. However, for the personnel on the Atlantic Wall, the conclusion materialized in a solitary, terrifying instant of understanding. It was the instant they witnessed an armada that occupied the skyline, a heaven darkened with adversary aviation, and a capability that was not merely a military force, but the complete devastating mass of the contemporary manufacturing sphere. It was a novel category of conflict, one not within the spirits of combatants, but on the manufacturing sequences of facilities thousands of distance units distant. And for one German commander, gazing through his field glasses at an ocean that had transformed to iron, it was the daybreak he recognized. It was concluded.